Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
It's our annual bonus, I guess it's twice annual, maybe we do it during Pesach, I don't know, short Siddur class, and it's because everything I might want to say today, I'm going to forget by next week because it's fresh in my mind. And I just want to talk about what we talked about last week, which was the difference between the two words for teaching your children in the first paragraph of the Shema. We talked about first paragraph is Vishinantam levanecha, and the second paragraph was V'limadatem et b'nechem. Remember that? So we talked about what's the difference between those two words. You don't need to bother to look in your Siddur for this one. I mean, you can if you want, but so if I can sharpen the question, pun intended. The question isn't what's the difference. The real issue that the commentators look at is why does the Torah use the word vishinantam in the first paragraph? Because that is the unusual word. The normal word for teaching is to learn is lilmod, to teach is lilamed, and so v'limadatem epnechem in the second paragraph of the Shema is what we would expect for the word to teach your children. Vishinantam levanecha is the unusual formulation. So the commentators don't really look at what's the difference. They look at why vishinantam and what does that mean. So I looked in my handy dandy concordance, and it turns out that the lishanen, the verb, is actually pretty rare. It appears in the whole Tanakh maybe about 10 times, except for in the Shema, it always means to sharpen, and it is used generally about swords or arrows, okay? And it's generally a poetic word. Tends to be used in Psalms and Proverbs, and it's usually about bad people who are sharpening their swords. And it's used at least once about a sharp tongue, where I think it's meant to be metaphoric. It's the enemy's tongue. The enemy's tongue is sharpened as a weapon, like a sword or an arrow. So the only time when lishanen seems to mean something like teach is in the whole entire 929 chapters of the Tanakh is our place in Devarim chapter 6 in the first paragraph of the Shema. In other words, first paragraph of the Shema, the Torah uses a highly unusual word to mean to teach your children. All right, it's a word that only appears about 10 times in the whole Tanakh, and this is the only time where it means anything other than sharpening your sword or your arrow or your tongue to wound someone. So it's a highly unusual usage, and the commentators remark on it and talk about like why this word and what does it mean, and there are various interpretations that are given. So one is to when you educate your children, you're supposed to sharpen them so that they will be totally fluent, so that the words of Torah will not be, in Hebrew, it's shelo yigamgem, which means you don't say, well, I think it's, and you quote the verse wrong, or as my wife and I say, it's the wake you at 3 a.m. criteria, right? So most of us, like if you raised your kid Jewish, if you shook them at 3 a.m. and said, recite for me the first paragraph of the Shema, okay? Or some piece of Torah that you'd shared with your children. You want it to be such that they would be able to rattle it off like that. So one of the medieval commentators, it means teach in a way that people will become totally fluent. And again, you'd have to ask, what's that about? What are the devarim, the words? Is it just the first paragraph of the Shema? Is it Torah in general? Is it anything you teach? Okay. So one interpretation is teach them so that they will be perfectly fluent with these words. Another interpretation, looking at the similarity, and a lot of the people look at the similarity between the root shanan, shin nun nun, and shana, shin nun hey, which means to repeat or recite, and usually refers to the oral Torah, which is called the Mishnah. So one of the Mefarshim says it means teach your children oral Torah, period, end of story. All right. Vishinantam levanecha means teach your children that which we normally lishanot, repeat, recite, which is the Mishnah, which is the oral Torah. Teach oral Torah. I saw a very imaginative modern comment last night. Vishinantam levanecha, Rav Eli Monk took it to mean not teach it to your children, but repeat it or recite it for your children. Levanecha doesn't mean to your children in his interpretation, but for your children. That your Torah learning should be totally sharpened and fluent for the sake of your children. That it's not really about teaching, it's about your own learning, which is interesting because it fits in with the rest of the paragraph, because the rest of the paragraph is all the things you're supposed to do with the words of Torah, right? You're supposed to talk about them all the time. You're supposed to think about them at night and in the morning, and you're supposed to put them up on your gates and on your houses, et cetera, et cetera. All the things are things that you do with these words. So that interpretation kind of keeps the integrity of that thought. Something that you're supposed to do with these words is you are supposed to be fluent in them, meaning the educational function in this paragraph isn't actually about transmitting, but is you being, effectively, we'd call it a role model in how you learn your Torah, right? So Vishinantam levanecha means you should become a totally sharpened repeating tool of studying, of knowing your Torah for the sake of your children. Everyone get that distinction, right? So it's not teach the words to your children, but you should be a particular way for the sake of your children, that the educational function is really a role modeling one primarily. Let me see if I have it. I sent myself a text late last night about the different interpretations. And the modern Bible scholars tend to say that Shanan is really a variant of Shana to recite, that it's not meant to be sharpening in any metaphoric way, but rather it would be the same as, I guess, in biblical Hebrew would probably be, Vered, you can correct me, Vishinitam, Lishanot, to teach them to your children, right? Mm-hmm. Vishinantam is really just a variant of Vishinitam. Vishinitam. Yeah. You should recite them to your children. Again, teaching function in terms of reciting. So the modern Bible critics take all the fun out of it, and they tend to say there's really nothing about sharpening. It's just the verb is just a variant of Vishinitam, and it means the same thing as reciting. And I think they do that because there's nowhere else in the entire Torah where the verb to sharpen is used as a metaphor for teaching. Okay, so their pshat is it really means the same thing as vishinitam, whereas all the other commentators try to say, well, what does it mean to when we use a verb to mean to teach, when we use a verb that actually means to sharpen, what does that mean about the teaching that we're supposed to do? So there are a variety of answers that come up with that: to make your children fluent, or I'd like to point out the traditional commentator who says it's oral Torah really understands it as if it's vishinitam, because he's understanding it from the same shoresh. So it's an interesting example of how the commentators look at this highly unusual word that, by the way, we have all said approximately a zillion times in our lives and taken for granted. And I don't know how many of you ever stopped to think about it before, but I'll have to say until last week or the week before, when I had to reflect with you aloud on how come it says Vishinantam in one paragraph and Vilimadatem Otam in the other paragraph, I don't think I had ever thought about it before. Right? Like If you would have said to me, shook me at 3 a.m. and said, what does this word mean? I would have said, oh, it means teach your children, because you grow up hearing it in shul. Teach your children, and da-da-da-da-da. So, but it's actually a very, very unusual word, which is why various commentators explain it differently, because it's really not obvious at all in this context. So that's my little teaching for mini Siddur class today. Thoughts, comments? Again, your own midrash on why it's Vishin on Tom. Ilana, then Vered, then Marshall. Ilana.
It's more of an objection than a drash.
Okay.
So are the modern commentators then saying that the similarity in these roots and the very unusual usage means, in essence, that the writers of the Torah got it mixed up, that they used the wrong word, that they really intended to use the other word?
Well, they don't phrase it that way. They phrase it as, this is likely a variant.
Okay.
Shin Nun Nun here is likely a variant, which means Shin Nun Hey.
Because doesn't that kind of strip it of the really special meaning?
It is not the job of a modern critical Bible scholar to say what the special meaning is. It is the job of the modern critical Bible scholar to tell us what they think the word means.
Okay.
Right. Now, again, you could object to that by saying, well, but it doesn't. If that's what they wanted to say, then why didn't they say Vishini Tam? Right? The Torah says Vishinan Tam. They must have had a reason for picking that unusual variant. So we will allow your objection to stand, and I will not object to your objection. Vered.
Thank you.
I wanted to, first of all, thank you for all the chidushim, which is always nice. The way I understood it for so many years is that in the first paragraph, the learning was already done at least once. So now you just have to repeat it. And so the verb leshanen means to repeat something that you know and you just recite or repeat. And in the second paragraph, the teaching is from the beginning. So you have to teach. The children didn't know anything, so now you teach them.
Yeah, good.
So that's
right. So that's a good distinction. And the one thing that I want to say that I got out of my research is what you're saying Lishanen means in the first paragraph, nowhere else in the entire Tanakh
appears
the word Shanen mean that. Okay. That's kind of a later thing, and it's really, again, based on Lishanot, Sheni, repeat. And that is, by the way, a rabbinic usage of the word Lishanen, but not a biblical usage. So that's a later understanding. So when we're doing that, we're taking our later understanding and assuming that the word means that. It is striking that that word is not used anywhere else. There's plenty of teaching in the Torah. In the book of Proverbs, by the way, there's plenty of stuff about, teach your children, learn from your parents, etc. And nowhere is this verb used for teaching or learning. So that's interesting. Marshall.
Yeah, Avi, again, I want to thank you for making the reference to Shelo Yigam Game, that one would not stutter. And for those who want to follow up on that, according to Reuven Hammer's Or Chadash, it comes from Sifrei Deuteronomy 34, where it says, "They shall be so finely honed in your mouth that when someone asks you about them, you will not stutter, but will be able to reply immediately." Thank you for reminding me of that.
Right. So it's a midrashic. I saw it in a medieval commentator. I didn't realize it has a midrashic source. But again, your teaching is you should teach them so that they should be, again, I'm going to use with the sharpened, like a sharpened tool. Metaphorically, so that they would just be able to spit it out.
What's the whole Hebrew phrase? Shelo Yigam.
Yigam Gem.
Yigam Gem.
Ligam Gem. It's a probably an onomatopoeia, right? Yeah. It's like saying right. Ligam Gam Gam. Right.
It's a verb with 4 root letters.
Yeah. It's a 4-root letter, which is probably an onomatopoeia to imitate the sound that someone makes when they're at a loss for words or they can't quite remember what they're saying. And they're saying, it's like my children using the word like. several times per sentence, right? Right. As opposed to, so it's the opposite of fluent. Legamgem means you talk like gam, 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 gam. Right.
Didn't we say that Moshe was megamgem? He was kvat peh.
Correct. Right. Kvat peh, heavy of speech. Okay. We all got to go because it's
Moedim
Moedim
L'Simcha, Tuesday.
Thank you, Avi.
God willing.
Thank you. Toda rabah.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.